Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. I ended another presentation on American society in the 1920s, advising that care should be taken, lest we make the norm out of the exceptional. I pointed out a number of times that 60% of Americans in the 1920s were living on or below the poverty line. Yet, this was the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, so there is something exceptional to study, and that's what we'll focus on in this presentation. So what exactly was the Roaring Twenties? The first thing to note, and maybe the most important thing, is that it was very new, and it changed the world. It was revolutionary. It was an age that pushed the existing boundaries as social attitudes changed radically. Dance halls and nightclubs with new music and dances, and the fact that prohibition made alcohol illegal only made it all the more exciting. There were also women, the flappers, important enough for their own presentation, who were determined that they were not going to be left behind. Some of the nightclubs became world famous, like the Cotton Club in Harlem. However, the older generation saw the whole thing as an unwelcome, corrupting influence, encouraging a loosening of sexual mores. These are the customs and norms of behaviour. This was seen in the dance crazes of the 1920s, the Charleston, the Lindy Hop or Jitterbug, and the Black Bottom. You should check them out on YouTube. But older generations and more conservative-minded people saw these dances as almost animalistic and degrading, again encouraging a loosening of sexual mores. The radio brought entertainment into the home. Its impact was as great as the television in the 1950s and 1960s, or the computer, the internet and the mobile phone today. America's first radio station started broadcasting in 1920. By 1922, there were 500 of them, and by 1930, getting towards half of American homes had a radio, no doubt helped by the fact that they could be bought in installments. It gave them music, jazz and dance bands. It gave them plays, while sports broadcasts made American football, basketball, boxing, and more than any other sport, baseball, ever more popular. It is said that the radio created a new national habit, listening to sport. The cinema was a huge attraction, and with the growth in magazines, the life of film stars was a big attraction too. Hollywood became the world's movie capital. There were hundreds of cinemas in major cities throughout the country, some of which had 4 performances a day, and small towns would have at least one cinema. Cinema seats were made cheap, and by the end of the 1920s, there were close to 100 million cinema tickets sold each week. Some people went to the cinema as often as 3 times a week. The cinema provided escapism from the drudgery or hardship of real life. The cinema offered glamour, and by 1930, the talkies had arrived. The first full-length talking picture, The Jazz Singer, was actually released in 1927, and the movie industry soon discovered the selling power of sex. The first sex symbols featured in films like The Sheik, Forbidden Path, Up in Mabel's Room, and When a Woman Sins. Clara Bow was portrayed as the it girl, it being sex. We might regard them as tame today, but in their day they were the definition of daring. And what people saw on the cinema screen and what they read about the lives of the film stars was a great influence on cinema goers. When Rudolph Valentino died suddenly in 1926, 100,000 people filed past his body in the funeral parlour where he lay. And in fact, 2 funerals were held, one in California, the other in New York. Still, many of the older generation, as well as conservatives, were shocked by the loose morals shown in films, and the even looser morals of the real lives of the film stars. There was a call for films to be censored, but Hollywood moved first and censored itself. The film companies placed a self-imposed ban on nudity, and the length of kisses was restricted. What came to be known as the Hays Code stated, "No film shall be produced which shall lower the moral standard of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin." But still, there were those who thought Hollywood pushed the limits of what was acceptable. Getting the news was made easier and much quicker. Newspapers benefited from the advances made in electronic communications. They received stories from all over the world and reported on them quickly. Many papers published multiple editions in a single day. Radio became important for getting news too, often providing live updates. This might seem normal to us today, but in the 1920s this was very, very new. And in the cinema, newsreels, which were factual films about news events, proved popular too. As for the popularity of sport, baseball became hugely popular, with the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees the 2 top teams at the time. In 1926, Jack Dempsey, the world heavyweight boxing champion, fought Gene Tooney in front of 145,000 fans. Jack Dempsey was a superstar, but the biggest sports star of all was Babe Ruth, the New York Yankees baseball player. The impact of the car can hardly be exaggerated. Its impact can be likened to the aeroplane in the late 20th century. A move into the suburbs, more modern and less crowded, was made possible now that people could drive into work. Shopping was made easier too. The car opened up travel, whether to just visit family and friends more easily. In rural communities, a trip into town for shopping, or else a trip into the big city, or heading in the opposite direction, a trip into the countryside or to the beach. The car meant that holidays could also be taken further afield. Whilst for young people, it meant that they could escape their parents. There were those that worried that the car gave young people opportunities for greater sexual freedom, and so was leading to a lowering of morality amongst young people. Others thought that it led to more crime. If people could escape to the countryside, so could criminals escape from the scene of the crime, committing crimes where they weren't known and escaping by car. I've referred to sexual mores a few times. Attitudes regarding sex was one of the biggest changes American society faced, with a generational gap between young people and their parents growing ever wider. Sex, both before marriage and outside of marriage, was becoming more common, and contraceptive advice was now openly available. Now, I've tried to give you a flavour of just what the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age was all about. If you're a regular listener to my presentations, you'll know where you'll find more detail, but I'll whisper it anyway in my ebooks. And I haven't covered the impact this had on women, and indeed the impact that some women had on society. And of course, I'm talking again about the flappers. But that will be the focus of another presentation. For this one, it only remains for me to thank you, as always, for listening. Cheers.